So I guess we're on. This one is basically everybody wants a cabin, and a lot of people want like a cabin or some basically like some land where they can build a cabin for like an emergency or like a shit's the fan scenario. And I'm not gonna lie, a cabin or like an area where you have a cabin, like some land, a couple acres and stuff like that, is a very good place. It's a great place for you to like bug out, or when you're there, you like bug in. But a cabin is a cabin. Like that's something people gotta understand. A cabin is a cabin. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Like a cabin's a cabin, and a cabin will define how like your prepper scenario or what you prep for or what your basically your duration of the time there's gonna be. That a cabin will define like what that would be. A cabin, a cabin could be just like a 10 by 8, little room with a little wood heater and a bed, and that would be it, a little wood stove, and that would be a cabin. And then, you can move up to like cabins where like, oh, you got a cabin that's bigger than that. It could be like a 20 by 12, and then it has like a little loft area where like your bed's at, and at the bottom is like where your wood stove's at, and maybe like a little place where you can cook, keep food, a couch or something, a table. And then there could be a cabin with like a couple of rooms, and then there could be like those big cabins where like they're really expensive and they have multiple rooms. It's like a house, but it's a cabin. So depending on like what cabin you have or what cabin you choose or what cabin like you build, that basically will define on your cabin scenario. And in my case, I don't have a cabin, but I have a double mobile and I call it the cabin, and I'm fixing it up and everything. And this is kind of like my cabin. I know it's a double mobile, it's not technically a cabin, but I'm fixing it up where like it's technically becoming the cabin. I call it the cabin just because, hey, come to the cabin, even though it's like come to my house. But I'm designing this place to kind of be like a cabin, even though it's a double mobile. I'm just working off with what I got to make it a cabin. But like I said, the cabin you basically choose to have as like what you're gonna be at, that will define like the time you'll be spending there and how much you can do there. Now, if you're thinking about like a cabin where it's like I have a cabin and I go there like in the winter a couple of times, and I basically just have the fireplace going. It's a relaxing place. I just like to go there on vacation. That's one thing. Now, there's also like other cabins where people have and they live there like all year long. And if you're like prepping and trying to be a prepper and thinking about getting a cabin or something, think about how your life is. Like, think about how your day consists of, like your day cycle. Like, that would basically define of how your cabin should be. Because if you're used to if you're used to just pushing a couple of buttons to heat up your house or a couple of buttons to cool down your house, you really got to consider that like with your cabin. And if you don't have your cabin pretty much set up in somewhere in the means of that, then you really got to think about like your cabin scenario, because you can basically make your cabin in an off-grid scenario where like you have everything. You can have your fridge there, a freezer, you're hooked up to solar, and basically everything's just based off of solar. Your water heater, your cooking, everything's based off of solar. The way you heat up your house, it can be based off of like firewood. The way you cool your house in the summer can be based off your solar. Like, you really got to dive into like what would your cabin basically initially be. And in my experience, when people are like, hey, I want to get some land, I want to go off grid, and I see the way you do your stuff, and I kind of want to be like that. Like, you're trying to do your garden, you're basically implementing an orchard, you're trying to create fields where like you can have a cattle or a couple of heads of cattle, and you're gonna move on to like building a chicken coop. You're really trying to go off grid and do homestead and stuff like that. In my experience, when people tell me that, I tell them like this. I tell them like good luck, because it's a lot of work. I'm not gonna like run around the bush on this. It's a lot of work, and I don't really see a lot of that on like YouTube where people like they really define like, hey, like this is a lot of work. Like no joke, like this is a lot of work. I do see a lot of people doing a lot of stuff and they're like, oh yeah, it's all great, it's all dandy. They're all happy about it, but I never really seen anything where like, yeah, it's a lot of work. And I'm here to tell you like, hey, it's a lot of work. And you know, me saying it's a lot of work shouldn't basically discourage you into like thinking of getting a cabin or going off grid, but it ain't easy. And that's something to think about. Like if you see YouTube, if you're on YouTube and you're seeing videos where like, oh damn, that seems so easy. It's not. It's not easy. They make it seem easy, but when you're actually like there and diving into it and trying to do it, it's not easy. It takes a lot of work. And honestly, if you can do the work and like struggle through it, it will be easy. But just right off the bat, it's not easy. And another thing I really don't see a lot of people showing on YouTube is it's expensive. That's another thing. Like trying to do something like this is expensive because you're trying to create something where like you have everything. So if you're trying to like do solar panels, you need batteries, wiring, you know, you got to convert everything to like LEDs to save you money, even though like all that's expensive. You really got to think about it like that stuff, like when you're trying to do like homesteading and off grid, eventually there'll come a point where like it was worth the money. But just starting off the bat, we're like, hey, I bought some land, I'm going to build a cabin, and I got to implement solar panels, I got to dig out a well. All that increments of like stuff you add is expensive. And I'm saying this because I don't want people to be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna buy some land and it's gonna be easy and everything. You really gotta know it's gonna be expensive. And even if you could do the work, like that saves you a whole lot of money. If you could do the work where you like, I bought some land and you know, depending on how much money you buy some land on acres and location and everything. Let's say you buy some land and you're like, there's nothing on it. And you know what? First thing I gotta do is I gotta pay a company to dig me a well, and there goes like maybe like 20 grand right off the bat, plus whatever you paid for the land. And then once that's there, it's kind of like, okay, now I got water, I need to build my house or a cabin or a place or something to stay at, you know, and then that can be expensive. Now, if you can buy all the material, like let's say you go like a big box store and you buy all the material there and you basically have an idea what you're doing and you basically do the work, you won't have to pay a company or someone else to build you a house, and you could do a really nice small cabin like that, but the materials itself will come out to be expensive. That's just how it is. I remember a time where like a piece of plywood was $10, and then you know, a few years ago, a piece of plywood was like $18. The other day I was like $33, $35 for a plywood. I was like, what happened? Back in the day, like, I know there's inflation and all that stuff, but like back in the day, you were able to like buy 2x4s for $2. Like they were like $1.88, and now they're like heading to like $6. So I'm telling you, like, back in the day, it was a little more easier, maybe because everything was a little less expensive, but like how things just became to be, everything's just really expensive. So just imagine building like a cabin. You're looking at about like $5,000, where $5,000 can build you a nice small cabin, and you could basically, you know, live there, and then move on and build other small cabins around your property. But just think about it, like 20, you know, depending on how much you buy your land, you know, 20 grand for a well, $5,000 for like a small cabin, you can make it work. But then along the lines, you're looking at about like $50,000 to $80,000, maybe 100 grand on this like investment. of a cabin. And it's a lot less because you didn't pay someone to do that all that for you. But then again, like it can be expensive. Now, if this is something you're looking at getting into, and like buying a cabin or like building a cabin, buying some area where you can do all this stuff, I don't want this amount of money discourage you because you know in the city of Tucson, most of the time right now, like you're gonna go buy a house, you're looking at 150 grand. Like I know there's houses less than that, but just like in a medium or starting point, 150 grand. And 150 grand, you know, it's just the house and the property, but then again, it doesn't include like acres and ability to like expand and do other things. So if I'm dropping like, hey, starting off with some land and building off a cabin by yourself, dig a well out, you know, without even including a bunch of other stuff that you got to implement in a cabin area land scenario, 100 grand may be for somebody like, oh damn, 100 grand, that's quite a bit of money. But just think about it. You're gonna go buy a house, and you know, just a regular standard house, the starting level is like at 150 grand. So just think about that. Just think about that. If you get an area where you do that and you got 100 grand invested with a small cabin, you still got the ability to invest another 50 grand into something where you'll have plenty of more acres and plenty more ability to expand without having the notion of here's like a quarter of an acre or maybe less of a quarter of an acre and a house and 150 grand. Just think about that. Like, that's the reality of it. For me, just to give you insight of me, I have this place and it's 6 acres. 6 acres plus a double mobile and like a fully developed shop that there's nothing in. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff in there that I have in there, but it's just like a dome shop. Like it's a shop. As soon as I like build stuff in there and like implement everything in there, like it'll be a fully functioning like shop. So just with that, like a double mobile, 6 acres, a well already included, a big old shop, and like a bunch of mesquite tree coverage where like that's where all my firewood comes from and everything. That is like 140,000. So I opted out in buying a house in town from like 150 to $180,000, and I bought this place even though I'm like, yeah, it's expensive. You know, every little thing you buy will be expensive either way. But like compared to buying a house at $180,000 in the city to here at 140 grand, it's totally worth it. So I don't want to be saying like, hey, you're looking at 100 grand just to start off with. Hey, don't get me wrong, you can do it with less if you find like maybe there's cheaper area, cheaper land, maybe it's not that expensive where you're at. Maybe you find a way where like you can build stuff with recycled materials. Anything is possible. But just off the bat, like 100 grand, I don't want to throw you off on that, but that's kind of how you should think about it. But hey, people waste, 100 grand on throughout the years with just nonsense. So I don't want to discourage you when I say like, hey, this could be like 100 grand, but who knows? Maybe that 100 grand, you may have a house in town, in the city, you buy some land, and then you basically go off of it just little by little, invest little by little, and who knows? You might end up just loving it, and you move out there and you sell your house in town, in the city, and then you basically end up kind of paying off your land and everything you built on your land, and there you go. It's like you invested in that, and then in the end, you basically saved money, and you round it all the way back to like $0, and maybe you're left with like owing 20 grand in the end because you sold your house and then you just put it all in the property, and then you're basically like almost debt free. So just think about that. Like when I say like 100 grand is like the baseline, but then again, it could be less. If you're looking at this and if you're looking at this video and on this channel, and maybe you're like, hey, I got 5 acres or something, and I built a small cabin, and it cost me like 40 grand, not 100 grand, 40 grand, whatever. Put it down there. Let people know that maybe my 100 grand, level is not all of that. But like I'm telling people in the aspect of like if you get some land and want to build a cabin and all that stuff, just think about a baseline where like it's 100 grand. But then again, it's 50 to 100 grand less than if you buy something in the city. Another thing, like on YouTube, when they're like saying like, oh, there's not really that much of people like saying how expensive it is, but then it's all like everything goes smooth and they really never show when anything goes wrong. Another thing is like when people they come out here and they visit me and they do stuff like that and they're thinking about like homesteading or trying to like do something where like they off grid, and I'm trying to go off grid. Just I'm gonna mention that right now. In the future, I want to be fully off grid. But then off grid initially still means you're on grid. It's a little weird. I'll do a video on explaining what that means. But I kind of want to be off grid and no debt and everything. Well, when people come out here and they look at the place and they see everything I'm doing, they're just like, maybe it's a little too much. And I don't want to discourage people on that either, where they're like, maybe we shouldn't get into it. No, you should get into it, but like, it's work. I'm not going to lie, it's work. And when people come out here and they're just like, whoa, you're doing all this? Like, and I'm like, yeah, I'm trying to start a garden. And for me to start a garden, I have to like clear all these trees. I got to do all this stuff. It ain't how people perceive it to be like on YouTube. So, sometimes people want something and then they try it and they're just like, yeah, maybe I should have done it. And so I like to tell people like, hey, if you're really gonna think about doing this, it's quite a bit of work. It ain't fairly easy, but once you get the hang of it, it's still a lot of work, but you're used to it, and in the end, once you implement it and have everything set up, it will be like 80% less work. You'll be just working 20% of the time. So just think about that. It's a lot of work, but once you get to that point, you will only be working 20% of the time. So going back to like my house where I call it the cabin, but it's a double mobile. When people come over, we basically just all cooped up in the living room, because most people come around during the winter because it's cold, and in the summer it's just excruciating hot here, and I don't have an AC system, so people don't come here in the summer. They come out in the winter. So when they come out in the winter, people come over. We basically just like hang out and chill like in the living room and everything, because that's where my fireplace is at, and that's where I heat up like I heat up the house with the fireplace. Now, I would love and I wish for it to happen sooner, but it doesn't seem like it'd probably be as soon. But I would love for me to have a couple of guest houses, which I'm thinking about like small cabins, just a room, maybe with like a bathroom, just a small bathroom. Um, just something really small where people can have like their own space. I don't mind people in the house and just hanging out and doing everything, but sometimes like towards the night, people would like to have their own space. So I kind of want to do that where like I have a multitude of just maybe like 3 small cabins, and that would be like enough space for room in here and then room outside and everything. So that's something. This is something like I really recommend for people that are trying to like, if they're prepping and they want to have like a cabin space or something like that. Like build a small cabin to start with, and then build a small cabin to start with, but like a small cabin with like everything, the kitchen, the bathroom, everything like a small cabin. Like you want that to be your home, and then also like if you can, I really recommend this where like you start building like other small cabins where there's the cabins could be like just a room and the wood heater, and then or a room, the wood heater, and like a small bathroom, and then have a couple of those, and then have like a building which could be like the main living space where like there's a big kitchen, there's a bunch of tables, there's like bigger bathrooms in there. Make it seem like a camp, because in a prepper scenario where like shit's the fan and you're gonna have like if you're the one with the land and no one else buys land, you gotta really think about like people that know you got land in your family, they're gonna go to you first. Like they're gonna try to go to your house first because they know like that person has land. We're gonna go to their house because if anything happens, we'll be together. We'll be safe there. You gotta think about that. Like if you're the person with land and building like cabins and stuff like that, people will flock to your area. So if that's something you really gotta think about like if you're building like small cabins where like if people come over, like hey, at least they'll have a room where like it's their room, and then a main area where like you guys can like get together and do meals and plan stuff and stuff and do stuff like that. So yes, think about it like an actual like a camp facility. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking of doing here in my place myself. Like my house is my house, of course, I don't mind people coming over, but I do want to have those like guest rooms out there where like when people come over and they're like, yeah, or like there's a lot of people and maybe some more people show up and like, hey, can I just basically have like one of the cabins? Like, oh yeah, for sure, get one of the cabins. But I also want to have like a kitchen area outside, like a big kitchen area where like we can do like a brick oven for breads, an oven for pizzas. It's a whole implementation I'm doing here where it's kind of becoming what I'm recommending. So that's something I really recommend is like if you have like land with a couple of acres and you're trying to like do like cabins, do a multitude of cabins. They don't have to be like huge cabins. They could be small cabins, but also build something where like it's a common space, a common area where like people can basically cook there, get together, play some games or something. Like just think about that, like that cabin, the cabin camp idea is really good. So another thing I should mention is when you're building cabins, most of the time cabins have a wood stove, and they're technically more like a wood heater, but they're wood stoves. So, if you don't know how to run fires, maybe you should consider about like how your cabin would be, or really start getting into practicing on building fires in like wood stoves because there's been times when I used to work in New Mexico, there was a small room I used to sleep in. Sometimes I would put like way too much wood in the wood heater, and the little room would get so hot. We would have to like open the doors to just air it out because that's how hot they get. And sometimes also you may not put as much wood as you think you need, and then in the middle of the night it gets cold. So that's something to consider where like you have a little cabin area, a little cabin spot, and you got a little wood stove, and you got to learn how to run those stoves and run those fires. They're not really that difficult. I think the cheapest one you can get is like somewhere from like Tractor Supply, where it's like those old like Frontier like wood stoves where they have like two plates on the top and it's elongated and there's a stove pipe that goes up, and they're really easy to set up. But it doesn't have like some of the newer ones where you can basically adjust like the intake and the outtake, so like you can adjust how fast your wood burns and how steadily like it burns so that not all the air like escapes at the same time. The ones I'm talking about, the cheaper ones, yeah, they have like four legs. They're kind of squarish or more rectangle, I should say. And you open it at the front and you stick the wood in there, and there's two plates on top. And there's really not much like, unless you basically drill and put like a damper valve in the pipe itself, like that just basically heats up the room, but also like whatever you put in there, like the heat's gonna escape. Once you heat up the room, a lot of heat won't escape from there. But like as you're burning stuff in the stove, like a lot of that heat pushes out. So whatever, like maybe like 40% of what you're burning heats up the room, and then 60% basically goes out. That's kind of how my chimney is, because my chimney is an open chimney, so it's kind of like that. I have to like really, really burn my fire super hot and load my chimney pretty well so that there's enough heat pushing towards the house, and then the rest just escapes. It's not a very good it's not a very good chimney if you're thinking about like conserving like wood and stuff like that. But it's the chimney that was kind of implemented here before I got the house, and we just kind of made it a little bit bigger, so we kept it that way, and it works. It works perfectly fine. I don't have any problems with it, and I like it. But I am thinking of putting a chimney or a wood stove, an actual wood stove, in the kitchen, and then in the master bedroom when I'm done with that, um, a wood heater. So right now, that's basically heating up my house. But in the future, that won't be used as much. But it will be implemented where it won't waste as much wood because I'll have two other, wood heaters, wood stoves running pretty much at the same time. So yeah, so that's one thing. Like if you're having like a cabin and you don't know how to run fires, that's something you should think about. Um, the funny story here is my brother was here a couple of days when I was in town, and he was like, hey, is the chimney cap open on the top? And I was like, yeah, it's open. Chimney's ready to go. And he wanted to spend a couple of nights here with his family, and I was like, yeah, go ahead. But then I did tell him, I was like, hey, I hope you know how to run it. I hope you know how to run I hope you know how to run that chimney. And he's like, yeah, I know how to run chimneys. And then a couple of days later, when I got here, I was like, where'd you put your ash at? And he's like, oh, I didn't really use the chimney. And I was like, why? I was kind of scared if I was putting too much wood in there. And he had like a little bit of like just a small couple of logs, and I was like, no, dude, you you need to put like a bunch of wood in there. Like it's a chimney. Like this ain't no joke. Like you gotta put wood in there, and he didn't get it. So you know what I mean? That's kind of funny for me, where it's kind of like yo, like know how to run the chimney, and he's just like yeah. And it was like no, you didn't even ran it correctly. It didn't smoke the house or anything, but it's just like he could have added a lot more wood without him being actually kind of scared of like the fact that like, hey, what if I burn your house down? I was like, nah, dude, you're not gonna burn the house down. You have no idea how much wood I put in there to heat up the house. You're definitely not gonna burn the house down. So yeah, so if you don't know how to run, like a wood stove or wood heater, think about that. And there's like loads of videos on YouTube on that. So I'm not really gonna dive into like how exactly you should do it. But you can buy, like I said, Tractor Supply has one of the cheaper ones of a wood heater, and those are fairly good for like if you're doing like a multitude of like cabins, because just like a couple of logs in there will heat up the room nicely. But then there's also like the ones where you basically like they have like the intake of air and then the outtake, so like it would allow you to burn the wood a little bit better. And then those you could just get at a big box store. They're more expensive, maybe ranging from like 400, $600, but like they're worth it. I used to work some of those back when I used to work in New Mexico, and they're really worth it. One of the heaters I do want to get, and I don't know if I can find one, but it's one of those like when you see like a military movie or something, and they're like when those canvas huts or whatever, they got like those standing like barrel looking, wood heaters like in the center of those like, I forget those like in the mess hall areas where the people in the military eat and everything, like right in the center of there is like one of those like barrel looking like stovepipe, standard vertical ones. Those are one. That's one I really want to get and look into, because I feel like if I can find one and they're a little more worth it, I might end up switching out the chimney we have here and put one of those, just because it might be a little more efficient in heating up the house or heating up what I call my cabin. But yeah, there's like loads and loads and loads of different like wood heaters and wood chimneys or wood stoves, where you can basically like dive into the web and just find like lots of different ones. And some of them are for aesthetics, some of them might look nicer, but if you're thinking of like prepping and doing something a little more practical, where like you can build like an 8 by 10 room with like a little wood heater in there, like just go with those like cheaper ones that you can find like at the Tractor Supply. There might be some other websites that have them a little more cheaper, or you might get them on Amazon or whatever. But like, you know what I mean? Like if you're thinking of building like a multitude of a couple like guest houses, those are the ones to go just because, they're less expensive, and for the amount of room that's going to heat up, the amount of air, the amount of heat that escapes ain't that big of a deal. So, like, those are the ones I recommend if you're thinking of building like a bunch of little cabins, which I'm thinking of doing here. That's kind of like something I recommend because those are something I'm gonna be using. But yeah, there's a whole different like loads of different heaters that you can have in like those cabins. But one thing I'm gonna say just to end the whole like wood heater thing is, there is no like button. Nowadays, like in the city and everything, you press a button and you get comfortable. When it comes to this, it's like you want to get comfortable, you gotta work. You gotta work at it. It ain't like you push a button and the house is hot. No, you're gonna have to start the fire. Start it from small, add a little more like bigger sticks, and then you move on to like split logs, and then some rounds and everything. It's work to get comfortable when it comes to wood heaters. But are they worth it? If you got the land and you got the wood, they're totally worth it. And it's not like they're running constantly, where like the temperature goes down, the machine turns on. No, so you can basically wait out the day, and then towards the night where you're like, yeah, it's getting kind of cold. You can start it then, run it for a couple of hours, and then it'll last the night with the heat that you implemented back into your house. So it's not on and off, on and off, on and off like a machine, and you can control it like that with kind of substances with the type of material you have in your property. And honestly, if your property doesn't have like in like a prepper scenario, if your property doesn't have that much wood, there's always the ability to buy like cords of wood, and there's always like the ability to have like maybe like truckloads of wood delivered to you, where like it may be a lot cheaper than to buying like a propane and gas and everything like that. So that's something to think about. And also like location of where your cabin's gonna be is something very important, because in a prepper scenario, like a shit hits the fan scenario, like a zombie scenario, like that's my thing. A zombie scenario where like, hey, something happened, there's zombies, no more thing of going in the city and everything. What are we gonna do about wood? I'm like, yo, there's like 7 miles by like 30 miles, and just a handful of ranchers down this strip where like if anything happens, we can hike, we can drive the truck, across to the other ways, and there'll be like loads and loads and loads and loads of wood we can harvest from, from dead wood to maybe some trees that we can see that are like, hey, that tree's basically like reaching its end point. We should cut it out. Because even if you do this, you got to think about like, don't just cut a bunch of trees. Like think about that tree's pretty big and there's like a lot of dead limbs on it. That tree's ending its cycle, and there's a bunch of little trees around it where they can use the space to grow, and you basically help out. You basically help out the forest like that. So in a prepper scenario where shit hits the fan, you know, you really got to think about your location where you're going to put your cabins, because, or buying property for cabins, because if something happens where like there's no more world and you need to like get wood, maybe you can't have wood delivered to you anymore because that doesn't exist, but you can hike maybe, 300 yards, a couple of miles, you can drive the truck a couple of miles, and there'll be places where you can harvest wood. So that's something to think about as well. So another thing, with the cabins is now a lot of people are getting into like the mini splits, and mini splits are a fantastic idea. But when it comes to like mini splits, you gotta understand like that requires electricity. So if anything, if you're like building a cabin and you want to have like the wood heater, but you're like maybe a mini split might work, or if you have the ability to put like one of those window AC machines, you know those require electric. And if you're not doing all your cooking and everything on the wood stove, you really got to consider on electric or propane. But propane can last forever. Let me just add this: propane can last forever if your propane tank and like your propane um, connections and everything don't mess up. Whatever's in the propane tank can last forever until it runs out, technically. So just think about that on propane. But on electric, it's kind of like if you're building a cabin and having like a cabin space to build like multitude of cabins, and you have the ability to like, hey, in the back of the cabin, we're gonna build like a little small shed, but that small shed is gonna be wired up to batteries and solar panels, and then the inverter and everything, and then this can power maybe a couple of lights, and then an AC, a wall, a wall AC unit for the summer. You're pretty much set on on electric on that, and then in the winter you could basically burn wood, but then if in the winter you want to run the whole like heater system on the electric, you can do that as well. So that's something else to think about. Where like if in the summer it gets pretty hot where you're at, and you want to have something like that, you got to start thinking about in the future implementing solar panels on basically like something really big where it can power like each cabin, or you can have it where like each cabin it's its own separate little system. And I recommend that a little more just because each cabin is a little better if it's its own little separate system. And that's just my personality on my perspective. But when it comes to like shit's the fan, you have a cabin, but the summers, you haven't really thought about the summers. Maybe you should start thinking about like looking into like how to do like some solar panels where you basically like hook it up to the little cabin and it'll just work just fine. And they're very at that point it's kind of more economical because you're really not using that much on the solar system itself. It's just lights and then like a little cooler or something. When it comes to like if you have like a main area where you have freezers, fridges, a bunch of lights, that might be a little more expensive because it's a little bit bigger. But compared to like the amount of people you're gonna have, it might be worth it. Now, one thing is like if she hits the fan and you got like a cabin area, you got your acreage, and you moved on, and you're starting off with you know you're starting off and building like a cabin and everything. One thing you gotta know is if it's a cabin, it's just a cabin. If you're thinking about having cabins for like a prepper scenario, she hits the fan scenario, zombies, you know, um, anything like that, a cabin is just a cabin. So if you have acreage and thinking of doing some cabins and stuff like that, you also really gotta think about like gardens and an orchard and things like that because a cabin is just a cabin. But if she hits the fan and it just goes really, really, really bad, and you really have no idea like how long it's gonna last, you really got to think about like implementing, gardens or cabins. I mean, gardens or orchards. So, and it ain't like you plant a seed of an apple, and like next year you're gonna have a fucking tree full of apples. No, that takes a lot of time for it to grow and produce apples. So my recommendation on that, if you start an orchard, is kind of like plant a tree you buy and try to stay away from like a big box store because they bring like trees from other areas that don't really grow well in your area. They just sell them. But try to go to like a local nursery where they have like fruit trees or citrus trees growing in the area which they do good in. So then again, like you have to buy like the tree, you gotta plant it, and then even then it takes like 2 to 5 years for that tree that's in a 5 gallon bucket that you planted to actually produce good yields. So that's another thing. Even if you like somehow shit's the fan and people are ransacking like the the Walmart or the grocery store or whatever, and you're the person that's like, we're gonna go to the cabin, we got no trees, we're gonna ransack that nursery, and you go and you just get a bunch of like, starts or whatever they have going on there, fruit trees, and you just load it up in the truck and you drive off because at this point, like, it's all over, right? And you go and plant it, trust me, that's not gonna give you fruit next year. It's just not. You may have like, if you plant a peach tree, you may have like 1 or 2 peaches the next year, but it ain't gonna give you like a good yield. If you're thinking of like a good yield where like each tree gives you like 50 pounds of fruit, 50 to 100 pounds of fruit, you really gotta wait, like, I'm telling you, like 3 to 5 years before that actually happens. So that's something else to think about. A cabin is just a cabin. So if you're thinking about like, property, cabin area, and all that stuff, think about a garden and think about an orchard. And another thing, if you haven't planted anything and like something happens and you go to the cabin spot and you're like, well, I guess we're gonna be here, we're gonna have to start planting stuff, and you never actually planted stuff, tough luck, man, because it's not as easy as it looks either. And then again, I'm not trying to discourage you where it's like, well, maybe we shouldn't do this. No, do it. But I'm saying, like, you don't plant a seed and it's just like, we got a bunch of stuff. And a lot of times I do this myself. Like, I plant a seed and I look away and I look at it to see if it sprouted. And that's not how it works. But I do it every time. It's just so stupid, but it's funny to me where I'm just like, every time I do this, I look at it to see if it sprouts. But like, no, it's going to take like a week or 2 weeks for it to sprout. So think about that where like, you need to learn how to garden. And if shit hits the fan and you're going to the cabin and you're going to be growing stuff, you really need to know how to garden. So think about that where like you're gonna thinking of getting a cabin, and then you're like, oh, maybe this skeptical prepper guy makes some sense. We're like, hey, he's right. We should think about, like, if we got a cabin, we should think about maybe we should clear some stuff for a garden and maybe plant a couple of fruit trees. But just don't think it's really easy. It's not like the movies. It's not how people make it seem to be. We're like, oh yeah, it's so easy. Most of the time, people on YouTube, they have all this great information, great pictures, great views, great footage, and they're just like having like all this amazing stuff. Look at their views. I'm telling you, look at their views, and if they got like 100,000 views on a video, maybe even less than 100,000 views on a video, those people get paid to put those videos up because they reach that point in viewers and subscriptions and all that stuff. But like, look at those people and their views. I'm sure they wouldn't put anything to discourage people. Who are like, oh yeah, I planted this and it just got totally ruined. It's a horrible, fuck my life, had to start over, it's so hard. If people would watch that, they would be like, you know what, maybe this isn't good. No, but they have everything that makes sense, makes it seem easy. They have all the views and they're getting paid to have those views because as people get viewed, they get commercials and then they get paid. So think about it, like if they're putting like very good content to have people's appeal, they're gonna get paid, and so that's all they're gonna put. We're like, it's so amazing. But in reality, it's like, it's not like that. It's really hard work, and and I don't want to discourage people when it comes to like, it's hard work, but it is hard work. It's not gonna be easy, but like I said, once you get past that point where like everything is set up, you're only gonna be working like 20% of the time. And that's the truth of it. So when I say if you're thinking about getting some land and probably building some cabins and stuff like that, think about like step one, you know, because if something happens and all you got's the land and you don't even have a cabin yet, you're starting at step one. Or if you have the land and you got maybe like two little cabins going on and you're gonna think about, hey, maybe we should start doing like a garden, you're at step one. Either way, you're at step one on either one of those. So in a shit's the fan scenario where you have to go to the cabin area and you got like nothing implemented, you're gonna start like at step zero. Like no joke. I'm doing this. I'm almost close to like 2 years in doing this, where I'm working on the garden. I'm doing a bunch of clearings right now. I planted the orchard just this year. I have 10 fruit trees. I'm on step one. Like I haven't even got out of step one. Hopefully this year, like in the spring, where like I have a couple little small fields planted, I'll be in step two. But like think about it, like if shit's the fan and you're going out there, and I'm doing this on grid with sometimes people coming over to help me, you know, with money, I can go to the store and buy what I need. I'm on step one and it's hard compared to like if shit's the fan and you're going to the cabin and you don't have anything, you don't have plumbing, you don't have pipes, you don't have screws, you don't have anything. You're really gonna be starting like step like -5. Like really. So when it comes to like property and cabin and stuff like that, I really don't want to get into too much of like specific types of property, but just like property for cabins. Like this is like prepper, like property, a couple of cabins for my family, for my group. Like this is what this is about. So think about like gardening and orchards and animals. So if you go out there, shit's the fan, and you got nothing implemented, think about how hard that would be. So if you're thinking about this, I'm really considering for you to think about, starting in, gardening and orchards and stuff like that as one of the main things when it comes to cabins. Now, if it's like a cabin where you're not there all the time, you can still put orchards and somehow make it where like if you have a well, those orchards naturally get watered themselves, and every time you go out there you can feed them, you can feed the fruit trees and stuff like that. But like something like that is like a start, and it's a very smart start because trees last a very long time. Fruit trees last a very long time. And if you don't believe me, the majority, not the majority, like a good amount of hunters, like in like the eastern area, that they have property, they sometimes like plant, like they find an area where like, oh, there's deer walking around here. They clear it out. They do like a little plot where like they plant a little bit of food, and then they plant apple trees to basically like bring the deer in. They really don't take care of those apple trees a lot. And then those apple trees produce, they bring the deer in, they hunt on their land and all that stuff. So think about it like that, where like there's hunters that do this where it's kind of like they plant fruit trees and they really don't take care of it, and the fruit trees do well. I don't really recommend you doing that because kind of like, hey, you know what? Might as well take care of them. Might as well take care of the fruit trees. But then again, like when it comes to gardening and fruit trees, we're gonna get this to like another video. Plant what you're gonna eat. So when it comes to like property and cabin property, where you're thinking of like shit's the fan, prepping and stuff like that, an orchard. An orchard goes hardcore. If it comes to like gardening and orchards, orchard comes first. Like that's the first thing you should think about if you're not going to be on the property right off the bat to start with. And then you can move on to like creating like fields where you'll be able to plant, gardens when you have to go out there. So, but orchards, first thing you should do. Why? Because they take longer, but they will yield you more. Uh, so just think about that. Now, when it comes to like the type of cabin, that's all on you. And there is quite a bit of like videos of people like, oh, they don't really show like too into depth or like this is how you build a cabin, but they show enough where like this is basically how you build a cabin. Now, in my perspective, like the best, easiest cabin to build, like the roof style, is a shed style. The shed, like my recommendation on like the easiest like cabin type roof that you want to build is a shed roof, because it's just a single angle. So basically you can build a stud wall, like 4 stud walls at 8 feet, and then you would build a box. It's known as a box, where you do like 2 to like 4 feet, depending on how you want it or how long your cabin would be. 4 feet, 2 to 4 feet higher, that would be the box, and then you would lay your rafters on there, and then your roofing on top, which could be metal. And at this point, if you're doing like a prepper survival type stuff, might as well do a metal roof, and then you could harvest some of that rainwater. But yeah, so that's my recommendation. But like those types of cabins where it's just like nothing fancy, just 4 walls, shed type roof, they're really easy to build, and you could build a couple of them, fairly cheap. Where, like I said, you just need a little wood stove and a bed. Because in shit hits the fan, if people flock to your place, it'd be kind of cool to have like, okay, you guys get the first one, you guys get the second one, you guys get the third one, and then, we'll do something about the rest of the stuff and stuff like that. But yeah, I don't want to discourage people on maybe like cabins and stuff like that might be a little difficult. Anything is difficult. Just think about it, and if you do, it will be an investment. And if nothing happens, you got a great spot to go chill and relax, vacation. That's what a lot of people do with my place. I'm pretty much here most of the time now. But like for other people that are in the city the whole time, sometimes they're like, "Hey, let's go to that fool's house," and then they come out here and I'm like, "Yeah, hey, what's up, guys? Yeah, enjoy yourselves. I gotta go work. I gotta go work on the garden and stuff." But that's pretty much it. Cabins. Think about it. They're good. They're nice. They don't have to be that complicated. But just think about like everything where like shit's the fan, and people go there, you go there. Like, think about how long you think you might want to last there. If basically there's nothing else to return to the city, think about how much time you really want to be at the cabin before you have to, and there's no other way other than to move out. So think about it. Orchard, gardens, cabins. But this is basically, everybody wants a cabin until you need a cabin. And in my case, just to let you know, I have to go heat up my house right now with my chimney. So it's not a joke where it's like, oh, maybe this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. No, I have to go and heat up my house before. It's kind of like dropping temperature real fast right now outside. So I have to heat up my house in the chimney, with the chimney, where it's gonna drop below 20 tonight. So for me to basically be comfortable, I have to go work at that chimney for about 3 hours so it can heat up the house. So, skeptical prepper out. Prepare, survive, and let's be honest, you'll probably die. Anyways, probably shouldn't joke too much about that, but we're keeping that line.